computer science A-level taster session. If we were in school, we would be using a virtual machine for all our programming. The reason for this is that essentially programming is telling the computer what to do, and you can tell it to do positive things and malicious things. Computer viruses, Trojans, and that being examples of negative things you can do with computer programming. Therefore, we use a virtual machine to isolate our code from the rest of the computer system and network to protect it. At home, you'll be using Lazarus as usual. It is an IDE for Pascal, which is the programming language that we use in school. Most of you who've done GCSE computer science would have learned in Python rather than Pascal. The reason we have chosen to do Pascal is numerous. Firstly, it comes with a drag and drop interface, which is ideal for your project, which has to have a user interface, whereas Python, at least the default version, is text-based. Secondly, we every year have at least a couple of students who haven't done GCSE computer science before, and therefore if we all did Python, there'll be many people in the class far ahead of everyone else. So by using Pascal, a language that probably none of you have used before, we all start at a relatively similar level, at least where syntax is involved. Also, for those of you that go on to do computer science at university, it is of course more impressive to have learned several languages rather than just the one. Okay, so as mentioned previously, the programming language we'll be using in class is Pascal. The link to download it is on here. Currently, we use version 1.6. They have gone on to version 2, which we may be updating to at some point. But if you want the same software as we use in school, I would recommend using 1.6 at the moment. Next up, I would ask you what an IDE is. Hopefully you would know if you've done the GCSE. That is an integrated development environment. It basically gives you a range of different tools to help you with coding, debugging your program, and testing it out before you actually compile it. Right, we're going to start off with some keywords and terms. We have 6 here. If we were in school, I would get you to try and figure out as many as you can with the person next to you, but obviously you're on your own this time. So either pause the video and have a guess at as many of these words as you can. Okay, so a statement isn't a line of code. That is a common misconception. It is actually any individual step or instruction in the code. Depending on how you lay out your code, you could have multiple statements in a line. Next, an identifier is a name for your variables, functions, etc. So just as you are identified with your first and surname, your variables and functions will be identified using an identifier. Essentially, it's another word for name. Next, reserved words. These are words that have a use in the language already, so they cannot be used as an identifier. Examples include if, while, do, start, end, etc. Next, subroutines. A subprogram is a set of statements written to perform a given task as part of solving the main problem. It can be called using its identifier. Essentially, you will want to decompose any program that you create into as small chunks as possible. It's good programming practice, and over the coming lessons, we will establish why that is. There are 2 types of subroutines, procedures and functions. If you are familiar with Python, they just use functions for everything. So although you can have a procedure and a function, they're just called functions. But in most programming language, there is a distinction between them. and Lazarus, Pascal, which we're using, is one of those languages. So a procedure is a subroutine which performs a task but has no return value, whereas a function does return a value, and therefore it can be used in expressions and calculations. So at its simplest, the Pascal program has this basic form. Program N, where N can be any name that isn't a reserved word that you like, begin, end, and then statements in between. Identifiers can only contain letters, underscores, and numbers, and must start with a letter. It's very good practice not to use A, B, C as identifiers, but actually use something that has some meaning behind it. So the first line of the program is called the program heading. The rest of the program is the program body. Lazarus automatically opens by default when we open the virtual machine, although I have very recently got that changed, so discount that. And at least one space or an end of line must appear between adjacent identifiers, reserved words, and numbers. In other words, you need a space between each item, each element, as you build your code. So whenever you buy a book teaching you a new programming language, it is a tradition that the first program that you write is simply one that prints to the interface, hello world. And we're going to maintain tradition and do that here. In order to write to the console, we need to use the built-in function writeln. So using the template before, we've now filled it in. We've called this program hello world, and we simply have one line of code, one statement, writeln, in speech marks, hello world. The brackets, obviously, because it's a function, just like sum in Excel, we will have brackets to contain the input to the function. The text to be output must always appear within apostrophes or string quotes. This indicates that it is a string. We'll go more into data types next lesson, but there are a variety of them. You may remember from GCSE, such as integers, which are whole numbers, booleans, which are true and false statements, and so on. Statements must always end with a semicolon, and that will probably be your most common mistake or error when you first start learning to code in Pascal. Python, you didn't need the colons at the end to indicate the end of the statement, as it read the spacing, but in a large majority of programming languages, that is not the case. Okay, take a moment to copy this code into Lazarus, run the program, and you should notice a problem. So pause the video, get that happening, and then tell me what you think the problem is. All right, so the issue is that the program runs and finishes before the user can actually read what is printed to the console. In order to stop that, we can add the read line function under the writeln hello world in order to pause to wait for a user input. This will allow the user to read what has been printed to the console before the program actually ends. All right. So I've put 4 variations of hello world onto the screen, and I would like you to first figure out what is wrong with each of them. So take a moment, again, pause the video, see if you can find the error in each of these codes, these blocks of code. All right, so the first one. We have used a reserved word for the program name. This is not allowed, as a while is used for iteration. Moving along to the right, or rather downwards, we haven't used apostrophes to indicate the string hello world, and therefore we have produced a syntax error. Third, semicolon is missing. And finally, we have started using an identifier with a number, which, if you remember from the previous slide, is not aloud. Right, here, 4 variations of what you've written already. Try and have a guess what you think each one will produce, and then test each one out in Lazarus. Okay, the first one prints out hello world with no spaces, all in one line. This is because the comma separates the 2 strings, hello world, but then prints them together. We haven't indicated any spaces, so it prints it out all in one line. Next, hello world on separate lines. Notice that the cursor has gone to the 3rd line, and this is because the right line prints out the statement and then moves the cursor to the next line. So the fact we have 2 right lines means that the cursor is going to go down 1 line each time. So we end up on the 3rd line. Next, we have hello, then a blank line, world, and then the cursor on the line below. The reason being, if we look at the 2nd line of the code, we have a right line which isn't actually printing anything, but it will just go to the next line anyway. Finally, hello world, much like the first one, all one line printed without a space. This is because the difference between right and right line is right line will print what's been said and then move to the next line, whereas right will just print what's been said and the cursor will stay where it is. Unlike Python, spaces and end of line make no difference to the compiler. So the human reader, however, it is incredibly important. If I'm marking your code, or trying to help you fix it, it's going to be much more challenging to do if it is poorly presented. So good programming practice is essential. That's using spacing correctly, indentation, sensible variable names. When we get to them, using subroutines as much as possible, and so on. We could also use comments in order to explain important elements of our code. You may remember in Python that we put in a code comment by using the hashtag. In Pascal, we can use a double slash for one comment that fits on one line, or for a more detailed comments, we can use the squiggly brackets. Remember that the computer ignores the comments. They are for other humans, more specifically the programmers that are working on the code with you. You'll see here, just like in Python, when comments turn red, here the comments turn blue to help you more easily distinguish the code from the comments. Right, we now have a series of exercises for you to put into practice the write and write line command that we did previously. Try not to use any functions, or there is no need to use anything that I haven't taught you in order to solve these problems. So if we can give them a go. Once you have finished, if you would like, there is an extension on the next slide, as you can see, in order to try adding some numbers together. All right, thank you.